Hi everybody, we're starting our next chapter in MYOB. We're going to be looking at payroll. So this is quite an important component of a bookkeeper's responsibility. We're going to be looking at two tutorials today, 17 and 18. 17 is simply a bit of information about the payroll and its components. And then 18 we'll be looking at setting up your payroll system in MYOB. Just a few notes here when it comes to payroll. The big game changer for payroll that has occurred last year and was obviously in effect this year, this current financial year, that is a term called single touch payroll, STP. And essentially what that means is that companies that employ staff are required to ensure that their accounting system, whether it's MYOB or Xero or whatever system they use, is compliant with the Australian Taxation Office's taxation reporting requirements. And what essentially that means is that it has the capability or the interface to interact with ATO and inform ATO every time you submit your weekly payroll run or your payroll batch, however you do it, the ATO is notified. So that's been the big game changer, and it doesn't require additional work if you are already using such a compliant software program. But if, for example, previous to the STP requirement, your organisation was doing things in a manual way or was using another program that was not or is not STP compliant, it means that you're obviously going to have to move across to a platform that would enable you to process using that single touch payroll system. So essentially what the idea here is that an organisation no longer is required to submit every financial year the employee's group certificates or payroll summary report to your employees. And what actually happens is every time you process your payroll and pay staff, it automatically updates the employee's details in the Australian Taxation Office's system. So an employee can at any one time log into MyGov and essentially have an update of their payroll employment summary. So it'll have their gross wages and the total taxes paid and whatnot at any time. They no longer need to wait until the end of the financial year for a company to provide them with a payroll summary report or previously known as a group certificate. But at the same time, the Australian Taxation Office is aware of the company's payroll data as well, so that at any one time the Taxation Office knows how many staff you have, how much your total gross wages are, how much superannuation is being withheld, how much taxes is being held. So essentially what that means is that it's important from a bookkeeper's perspective to ensure that every week when they submit the payroll run, that it's accurate. Because once you've submitted the batch, if there is a mistake made, it's not a matter of simply deleting and re-entering. You need to actually now put in credits and make adjustments. So that's the key thing that's occurred. But I'll cover a bit more information on STP at a later stage, but I thought I'd just bring that to the forefront on the outset. The other thing with our payroll in MYOB that I wanted to cover before we actually get into the system, I'm just going in and trying to look for that exercise. Just pop it on pause for one moment as I find that. As I was saying earlier, what you'll receive for your assignment 17 is the following information. What I wanted to just draw attention to is essentially what your payslip consists of, and understanding what these components are, because if you're new to payroll, you need to be aware of what your payslip consists of in order to ensure that all the right information is being entered when you're setting up each employee in your payroll. Now, the net pay obviously is what the employee receives in their bank, right? The gross pay consists of, for example, if the person's getting paid $20 an hour and they work a 40-hour week, then it's 20 times 40 hours a week, which I believe is $800. Hopefully my mathematics is correct. And then let's assume here that your taxes is $100. So the next net pay in that scenario is going to be $700. So that's quite straightforward. And your taxes here, the tax component is calculated using a tax scale or a tax table. And the MYB or any other accounting system will calculate that automatically. It does that via, there is a tax-free threshold component first, so an employee can earn close to $20,000 per year, which is prorated, obviously, when it's doing it on a weekly basis before they get taxed. And then the higher amount of money that they make, the higher the tax rate goes. So if they're earning, for example, $100,000 a year, they're in the higher tax bracket, and prorated is at $100,000 on a weekly basis. So let's assume here that comes down to being close to $2,000 a week. Hence, you're going to be getting taxed based on that higher tax bracket. So that's where that comes into the picture. The system does it automatically. The deductions are components that you need to be aware of. Now, some examples of some deductions may be, for example, union fees. Okay, some companies are part of, or some workplaces are part of a union, and it's highly recommended that you're part of such a union. And so, hence, that has to be entered in the system, and the correct category, in this case, is the deduction needs to be allocated, because this will affect the taxes. Because deductions themselves will be coming out of your pay as a deduction, but is taxable because it still consists of your gross wage. And I'll show you how that becomes important in a moment. So that's one example of a deduction. Trying to think of another example of deduction. So, for example, you might have laundry, for example. That might be something that could come out of your pay. Or another one would be social gatherings or social yearly social functions, for example, or you may be part of some sort of a social group in your organisation. And hence you would have selected or asked your employer to deduct from your wage every week, let's just say $10, and made that part of your deduction. So that's another example. Now, you can't use this method or this deduction in order to reduce your tax. Okay, so you can't say, for example, I want to become part of this group and that group, and have this being taken out of your pay in order to reduce your tax. So the way it's set up is quite important in order to be taxed correctly. Employer expenses are things that an employer needs to fork out for simply having you on the payroll. And a classic example here is your superannuation guarantee, which is 9.5%. That's an employer expense. So not 9.5% on top of your gross wage, okay, forms your superannuation. Now, that's an employer expense, although you may have other types of superannuation as well, such as employee additional super that the employee themselves wants to take out of their wage in order to contribute to their superannuation. Now, that's not an employer expense because it's an additional amount of super that the employee wants to contribute. So that's going to be a deduction. It's going to come out of your pay. I'm just thinking of other employer expenses. Workers' compensation is another one mentioned here. Another employer expense is payroll tax. Okay, so this is another form of tax. It's not your pay-as-you-go tax that is coming out of your wage. It's a different type of tax. There's a threshold of almost 800,000. If your payroll is more than that, then the employer needs to pay payroll tax. So that's another component that could be part of your payslip, but most employers tend to leave that out and have a separate component for that elsewhere in their P&L. But entitlements is an important one. You need to, as a person working in payroll, you need to be aware of what entitlements certain employees are entitled to. So, for example, if a person's part-time or full-time, they're going to be entitled to holiday pay and sick pay. The terms have changed now. Annual leave, 4 weeks, 20 days is your holiday pay. So they change the term to annual leave. Now, if you're part-time, if you work, for example, 20 hours a week, that gets prorated. So you don't obviously get your full 4 weeks. It gets prorated based on how many hours you're working per week. And you need to work that out in working in payroll. Another entitlement is, as I mentioned earlier, sick pay. The terms now changed. It's called personal leave. So you're entitled to 10 days personal leave. And that personal leave consists of if you get sick or if a close family member passes away, you're able to use that 10 days as per your personal leave. That's also an entitlement, all right? So that's only if you're part-time or full-time. Now, if you're a casual, for example, you're not entitled to that. You get a casual loading. So you get your gross wage, which is based on the award, plus a 25% casual loading on top of your pay, which forms part of your pay, so it's part of your gross pay. But that covers you for that entitlement that you're missing out, that 25% additional money that you're receiving. Now, your entitlement, if you're full-time or part-time, gets accumulated. Okay, so for example, if you just start working and you want to go on a holiday, 1 month into you starting your work, you haven't actually built up enough entitlement to take your full holiday. So you may only be entitled to taking 1 or 2 days holiday, annual leave. The remaining is going to be unpaid. So the system works out based on your entitlement and the award that you're under, works out how many hours of that entitlement you've accrued. And when you use that entitlement, it updates itself so that you know at any one time what your entitlements are. So that's a key component of entitlements. Now, RDO is another one, and we're going to cover that in a later exercise, rostered day off. I mean, it's something that was more prevalent earlier. These days, it's not as popular, or it's not as widely used. But we're going to be covering what that is and how it gets monitored. It's an entitlement, and it's based on essentially, in brief, those that work 40 hours a week get paid 38 hours. They accrue the 2 hours every week, and then they take a day off at the end of each month, and it's part of their day off entitlement. We're going to be looking at how to set that up and how that operates. So this table here, or this diagram here, is important for you to be aware of that. But more importantly, you need to be aware of what, I guess, examples of what entitlements are and what some examples of deductions are in order to set this up correctly. Some of the terms have changed a little bit as well. PAYE installment, it's no longer called PAYE, it's actually called PAYG, pay as you go. So the concept here is as you make money, as you get paid every week, you pay tax as you go. So that's where they've coined that term. So yeah, have a read through, and it'll give you a bit of an insight as to what these components are. And there's an example here of how it's all calculated as well. So that's a quick introduction. We'll look at tutorial 18 now, which is setting up your payroll. Okay, so it's just a quick exercise here. We'll work through that right now. I'm just going to minimize this, going to my MYOB. Now, it's important that you have a current version of MYOB, because every year we get revisions to our tax tables. If you're using an older version, so this is this year's version, if you are using an older version of MYOB, your tax tables are going to be may be out of date, and hence you're going to be taxing your employees incorrectly. The other thing that you need to be aware of as well with payrolls, it's important that you are familiar with your awards, because the award through fairwork.gov.au, that's the website, the award will determine what the minimal wage pay rate is, and it will also determine when your overtime will kick in and the overtime rates, because it all varies depending on